He put his hand around her throat in front of 40 people. Not a training hold, not a controlled demonstration. A grip. Full, deliberate, fingers wrapping her neck like he owned the space she stood in. While every instructor, every recruit, every witness in that room held their breath and waited for her to react. She didn't move. Didn't grab his wrist, didn't step back, didn't make a sound. She just looked at him. And Senior Chief Petty Officer Derek Colt, 8 years of SEAL operations, 31 citations, the most feared instructor on the base, felt, for the first time in his career, genuinely afraid of something. He just didn't know why yet. If this story hits you somewhere real, subscribe to the channel and follow every part to the end. And drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The morning began the way every morning at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado began. Cold, loud, and unforgiving. 43 personnel filed into the primary assessment bay at 05:45. Officers, senior enlisted, junior candidates, the full spectrum of a training command doing what training commands do. Sorting people. Deciding who stays and who goes. Applying pressure until something either holds or breaks. Petty Officer First Class Maya Reyes walked in at 05:47 and took a position at the far end of the formation. Third row, left side. Nothing about her placement announced itself. That was the point. She was 22 years old, long dark brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Olive green fitted short-sleeved t-shirt, deep v-neck, the kind that didn't hide much. Military camouflage cargo pants, tactical boots worn enough to be real. No medals, no insignia beyond the absolute minimum her cover required. She looked like someone's first week. She was not anyone's first week. But Senior Chief Derek Colt didn't know that when he walked to the front of the bay at 0600 and let his eyes move across the formation, the way a man moves his eyes across a chessboard. Calculating, categorizing, already deciding which pieces didn't belong. His gaze stopped on Maya. It stayed there 3 seconds longer than it stayed anywhere else. Then he smiled. Small. Private. The kind of smile that means he'd already made a decision. "All right," Colt said, loud enough to own every corner of the room. "Let's talk about what we're doing here, and who belongs here doing it." He was good at this. That was the honest truth. Derek Colt was genuinely gifted at the part of his job that required him to stand in front of a room and command it. His voice had that specific quality that military careers either build or destroy in a man. Complete, effortless certainty. When he spoke, the room didn't just listen. It leaned. "Advanced assessment isn't a courtesy," he said, pacing slowly along the front row. "It's not a program. It's not a stepping stone. It is a filter. And filters work by letting the right things through and stopping the wrong things. That's not personal. That's physics." Someone in the second row, a broad-shouldered candidate named Torres, nodded sharply. Colt stopped walking. He turned and looked directly at Maya. "You," he said. Not her name, just you. Front and center. The formation shifted slightly. 42 people adjusting their posture, their attention, their breathing. The way people do when something is about to happen, and the only safe choice is to be very still and very invisible. Maya walked forward, even pace, hands loose at her sides. She stopped 2 feet in front of Colt and looked at him the way she'd been trained to look at everything. Directly, without aggression, without submission. Just clear. Colt looked her up and down once. The gesture wasn't subtle and wasn't meant to be. "Name," he said. "Reyes, Senior Chief." "First assessment cycle?" "Yes, Senior Chief." He leaned slightly closer. Not so much that it was technically inappropriate, just enough to be a statement. "You sure you got the right base, Reyes? Coronado runs a little different from wherever you transferred from." The room didn't laugh, but the air shifted the way air shifts before weather. "I'm sure, Senior Chief," Maya said. Colt tilted his head. "You seem very relaxed for someone in their first advanced assessment." "I'm focused, Senior Chief. It reads similar sometimes." One beat of silence. Two. Someone in the back of the formation exhaled very quietly. Colt's jaw tightened by a fraction. It was the answer of someone who is neither nervous nor trying to perform confidence, and that bothered him more than either option would have. He'd been running assessments for 6 years. He knew the difference between someone faking calm and someone who simply was calm. And this 22-year-old with loose dark hair and an olive t-shirt was the second kind. That was wrong. People didn't arrive at their first advanced assessment already calm. They arrived terrified and performing calm, or they arrived arrogant and projecting calm. Maya Reyes was doing neither. She was just standing there, being exactly what she appeared to be. And somehow, that was the most unsettling thing in the room. "Return to formation," he said. She did. He watched her walk back. The first evolution ran 90 minutes, a mixed physical and cognitive assessment designed to layer fatigue over decision-making until the cracks showed. Colt walked the floor the whole time, correcting, pushing, occasionally pulling someone from a station and making them start over at the beginning for no stated reason. He didn't pull Maya. He watched her. She worked through every station with the same quality that had bothered him in the formation. Not fast enough to flag, not slow enough to criticize. Precise, economical. Every movement doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing extra. When the cognitive portion came, written tactical assessment under time pressure with deliberate noise distractors. Most candidates leaned over their papers and tried to wall out the room. Maya leaned back slightly, absorbed the noise, wrote without stopping. Chief Instructor Brenda Salas, 44 years old, 15 years in training command, was standing near the assessment tables when she noticed it. She leaned toward the junior instructor beside her and said quietly, "Watch her eyes." The junior instructor, 26, 8 months at Coronado, looked. "What about them?" "She's not blocking the distractors," Salas said. "She's using them. She's reading the room while she writes." The junior instructor didn't know what to do with that information. Neither did Salas, fully. But she filed it somewhere and kept watching. 7:30, post-evolution break. The formation dispersed to the hydration station. 43 people, moving, talking low, shaking out their hands. Colt moved through the room and stopped beside junior instructor Pete Haley, 28, 2 years under Colt, the kind of young man who had learned very early that the fastest way to survive Derek Colt's training rotation was to agree with Derek Colt. "The Reyes candidate," Colt said, keeping his voice low. "Pull her file. The intake copy, not the forwarded version." Haley nodded. "Looking for anything specific, Senior Chief?" "Looking for whatever's there." Haley went. Colt stood with his coffee, watching Maya at the hydration station. She was talking to a candidate beside her. Recruit Daniela Cho, 24 years old, 3rd week in the pipeline. The kind of woman who had run every physical evolution at the top of the group, but somehow kept receiving marginal performance notations that nobody could specifically explain. Maya said something. Daniela responded. Maya listened. Not the half-listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak. Actually listened, with her whole attention, the way people listen when what's being said matters to them. Colt watched that exchange for 10 seconds and then looked away. The combatives block started at 0800. This was Colt's element. He taught the combatives demonstrations himself, always had, even as a senior chief who could have delegated it. Because it wasn't about the technique. It was about the room. About who controlled the room. About standing at the center of 40 people's attention with your hands on someone and letting every person present understand the hierarchy of this space. He chose his demonstration partner the way he always chose them. Not randomly, with purpose. "Reyes," he said, "up front." She stepped forward again. Same walk, same hands, same eyes. Colt moved behind the demonstration table and picked up the training brief. First segment is control positioning, establishing physical dominance in a confined engagement. He set the brief down. "Reyes, face the formation." She turned, 42 people watching. Colt stepped behind her, then around her, then to her left side, adjusting her stance with 2 fingers at her shoulder. Training appropriate, technical, nothing wrong with it. Then he stepped directly in front of her, and he put his hand around her throat. The room stopped breathing. It was not a choke, not physiologically. His grip wasn't occluding her airway, but it was a hand around a 22-year-old woman's throat in front of 40 witnesses, and the message it sent had nothing to do with combatives technique. It was a statement of authority, a test, a line drawn in a room where he controlled every rule. React, and you failed the emotional control assessment. Don't react, and I've just demonstrated that I can do whatever I want to you in front of everyone. He looked at her face. She was looking back at him. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing had not changed. Her expression had not changed. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved in their head and are waiting patiently for the physical world to catch up. Colt held the grip for 4 seconds. 5. 6. And then something happened that he had not expected and would not be able to explain later that night when he was alone trying to reconstruct the moment. He let go. Not because she made him, not because she moved, not because anyone in the room said a word. He let go because standing there with his hand around her throat while she looked at him with those completely steady eyes, he had the sudden, visceral, irrational sensation that he was the one being assessed. He stepped back. "Control of the engagement space," he said, loud and even, addressing the formation. "Demonstrated." He turned and walked back to the demonstration table. Behind him, Maya lowered her chin slightly, rolled her left shoulder once, the single movement of someone who had just been grabbed and was confirming their body was fine, and returned to her position in the demonstration line. Nobody in the room said anything, but Chief Instructor Brenda Salas, standing at the perimeter, had already pulled out her phone. She typed a name into a search field she wasn't supposed to be able to access at her clearance level for a long moment. Then she put her phone away and looked at Maya Reyes, who was standing perfectly still in the demonstration line. Dark hair loose over her shoulders, olive shirt, camouflage pants, hands loose at her sides, and thought, "Who are you?" Across the room, unaware of Salas entirely, Derek Colt was flipping through pages on his evaluation clipboard with the focused energy of a man building a case. His hand still felt the absence of her neck, the way she hadn't moved, the way she hadn't made a sound. He had been putting people through this training rotation for 6 years. Not one of them had ever made him feel like that. He wrote her name at the top of a fresh evaluation sheet, and he underlined it. Twice. At 0847, while the formation was cycling through the second cognitive station, Pete Haley returned from the records office. He found Colt at the back wall and handed him a printed intake sheet. Colt looked at it, flipped to the second page, read. Flipped back to the first page, read again. Then he looked up at Haley. "This is the complete file?" "Everything I could pull, Senior Chief. But there's a block on the deep background. Federal classification hold. I'd need level 5 authorization to go further." Colt looked back at the paper. The intake information was clean. Almost too clean. The kind of file that answered every surface question, and none of the real ones. The kind of file that got assembled very carefully by someone who knew exactly what a training command intake review looked for. He looked across the room at Maya Reyes. She was completing the cognitive station, writing without hesitation, back still slightly relaxed, absorbing the noise. Colt folded the intake sheet once, put it in his pocket. "Schedule her for individual assessment tomorrow morning," he said to Haley. 0600 South Course. Camera Station C is offline for maintenance. Haley hesitated for exactly 1 second. "Just her?" "Just her," Colt said. "You, me, and Instructor Marsh. That's all." Haley nodded. He didn't ask why the camera station mattered. He already knew. And across the training bay, Chief Instructor Brenda Salas watched Colt pocket that paper and speak quietly to Haley. And she thought about the classification flag on her phone. And she thought about the hand around that young woman's throat. And she made a decision. She walked to the far side of the bay, took out her phone again, and made a call that had nothing to do with her position in this building or any normal chain of command she was supposed to use. The phone rang twice. Someone answered. "It's Salas," she said quietly. "I think you need to know. She's been made." Salas ended the call in under 90 seconds. She didn't look back across the bay, didn't change her posture or her expression, just pocketed her phone, picked up her clipboard, and walked back into the training rotation like nothing had happened. Because in this building, the most dangerous thing you could do was look like you'd just done something. What she didn't know was that Maya had watched her make the call. Not the content, not the number, just the movement. The deliberate walk to the far wall, the angle of the body, the brief tension in the shoulders that disappeared too fast to be natural. Maya had logged it the way she logged everything, without reaction, without adjustment, filed cleanly behind steady eyes. She already knew Salas had run her name. The classification flag generated an automatic notification to a secure line that Maya checked every morning. The flag had hit at 0803, 22 minutes ago. The question wasn't whether her cover was blown. The question was who Salas had called and what they were going to do about it. Maya finished the cognitive station, set down her pencil at the exact moment the timer ended, and stood up without checking her answers. Not because she was confident, because she'd been trained to make a decision and commit to it, and second-guessing it after the clock ran out was a waste of energy that might be needed for something else. She rejoined the formation. Colt was watching her from across the room. She didn't look at him. She looked at Daniela Cho. Daniela was struggling. Not physically. Her times were clean. Her form was precise. Her scores on the cognitive station had been among the best in the group. The struggle was something quieter and more corrosive than physical failure. It lived in the set of her jaw, in the way she completed each evolution, and then looked at her clipboard as if she expected the notation to say something wrong, regardless of how well she'd done. Because it always did. Maya had read Daniela's file 3 days ago, the version she'd been given access to as part of the investigation, not the intake copy that Colt controlled. The pattern was clear and brutal. Marginal performance notations that directly contradicted objective assessment scores. Comments like, demonstrates physical capability but lacks command presence, attached to evaluations where Daniela had outperformed 60% of the male candidates in the same cohort. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't even trying to be subtle. It was the work of a man who had been doing this long enough to believe no one was ever going to look. After the morning evolution cleared and the formation broke for equipment maintenance, Maya fell into step beside Daniela at the gear station. Casual. Two candidates performing the same task. "Your grip check on the third station," Maya said quietly. "You switched hands halfway through." Daniela glanced at her. Defensive, quick. "I know. My left shoulder's been tight." I wasn't criticizing it. I was noticing it. A pause. "Old injury?" Daniela hesitated. "Training accident, 8 months ago, before this cycle." "Did you report it?" Another hesitation. Longer this time. "No." "Because you thought it would be used against you?" Daniela didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either, and that silence was its own answer. The answer of someone who had learned, through repeated experience, that showing vulnerability in this rotation meant giving someone a tool to remove you with. Maya checked her gear and said nothing else for a moment. Then, "It won't be if you don't give it to him." "That's easy to say." "Yeah," Maya agreed. "It is." She paused. "How long have you been adjusting your performance scores in your head before he posts them?" Daniela went still. "What?" "Running your own numbers," Maya said. "Calculating how well you actually did, then automatically discounting it because you're expecting the posted score to be lower." The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone who has just heard their own internal experience described out loud by another person for the first time. Daniela's hands stopped moving on the gear. "How did you—" "Because you run it on your face," Maya said, not unkindly. "Every time you finish an evolution, you check the timer, and then something goes out of your eyes before you even see the score. You've stopped expecting the truth to match." Daniela looked at her. Really looked. "Who are you?" "Someone who wants you to stay in this cycle," Maya said simply. "Not for my reasons, for yours. You belong here. You know your numbers. Don't let him make you forget them." She picked up her gear and walked away before Daniela could ask anything else. At 1100 hours, Pete Haley delivered the individual assessment schedule to the roster board. The name read Reyes, M. Individual Performance Review, 0600, South Course. Nobody questioned it publicly, but 3 candidates standing near the board exchanged a look that said everything. Individual assessments weren't a standard part of this rotation. Everyone in the program knew that. Getting pulled for a solo session didn't mean you were exceptional. It meant someone had decided your future needed to be handled without an audience. What none of them could see was what Haley had done after he posted it. He'd gone to the bathroom on the 2nd floor, the one with no foot traffic and no camera coverage, because the base had been promising to fix the angle for 8 months. And he'd made a phone call of his own. Not to Colt, not to Instructor Marsh, to his older brother, who was a JAG officer stationed at the Pentagon, and who had been telling Haley for 2 years that the day would come when he'd need to decide whose side he was on. "I think that day's here," Haley said. "Tell me what's happening," his brother said. Haley told him. All of it. The file block, the solo assessment, camera station C, offline. The pattern of notations he'd been signing for 6 months that he'd told himself were Colt's call to make. When he finished, his brother was quiet for 4 seconds. "Pete," he said, "do not sign anything tomorrow morning. Colt will— I don't care what Colt does. You do not put your name on a document in an offline camera zone on a solo assessment. You understand what I'm telling you?" Haley understood. He stood in that bathroom for a long moment after the call ended, staring at the wall, understanding with perfect clarity that he had spent 2 years becoming a person he didn't entirely recognize, and that the only question left was whether he was going to keep going in that direction or stop. He washed his hands, walked back downstairs, and did not tell Colt he'd made the call. That evening, at 2,200 hours, the barracks were supposed to be lights out. Maya was sitting on the edge of her bunk, going over the day's mental notes. Not written, never written, when she heard the sound of someone on the far side of the room, not sleeping. The specific quality of stillness that is actually a person lying completely rigid, trying to disappear into a mattress. She got up, walked quietly to Daniela's bunk. "Hey," she said softly. Daniela didn't move for a moment. Then she sat up. Her eyes were dry, but her face had the tight, controlled look of someone who had been handling something alone for a long time and was running low on the resources that handling things alone requires. "I've been thinking about what you said," Daniela said. "Which part?" "The part where you told me to stay." She paused. "I'm trying to figure out why you care." Maya sat down on the edge of the opposite bunk. The barracks were dark enough that they were speaking to each other in silhouette, which made it easier somehow. Because what's happening to you isn't an accident, and it isn't your fault. And those two things matter. Daniela was quiet. "My scores are..." "Your scores are fine. Your actual scores, not the posted ones." Daniela's head came up. "How would you know that?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Maya measured her answer carefully. "I know how this rotation works. I've been watching the pattern." A pause. "You're not the first person this has happened to in this cycle." "The other women who washed out," Daniela said. "Yes." "They were better than me. 2 of them were better than me." "I know," Maya said. "So then how is staying here going to be different? What changes if I just keep showing up and doing the work and getting scored wrong?" It was the realest question anyone had asked Maya since she arrived at this base. Not a tactical question. Not an operational question. The question that lives underneath everything. The one that people carry when institutions keep failing them, and they're running out of reasons to believe the next attempt will be different. Maya looked at her for a long moment in the dark. "Something is going to change," she said. "I can't tell you what. I can't tell you when. But I need you to still be here when it does. Because if you're gone, it only changes for the people who come after you. And you deserve to be here for it, yourself." Daniela studied her face in the dark. "You know something." "I know a lot of things," Maya said. "Tonight, the only one that matters is this. Don't quit. Whatever happens tomorrow, don't quit." The barracks were quiet for a long moment. Then Daniela lay back down. "Okay," she said. One word, small and absolute. Maya walked back to her bunk. She sat on the edge of it and checked the recording device under her collar with 2 fingers. A habit so ingrained it was nearly unconscious. Green light, still running. Everything Colt had done today was on it. Everything he was going to do tomorrow would be on it too. But tomorrow was different, and she knew it. A solo assessment. No formation witnesses. Camera station offline. 2 instructors Colt had chosen himself. And a cover that had been partially burned by a classification flag that Salas had now seen and reported to someone. Maya lay down, fully clothed. She stared at the ceiling. She was not afraid of Derek Colt. She had been trained by people who could break Colt for sport and never break a sweat doing it. The physical reality of tomorrow morning held no terror for her. What kept her awake was the calculation. The mission parameters said observe and document. It said do not engage. It said your purpose is the pattern, not the incident. 3 women had washed out of this pipeline. 27 falsified notations in 6 months. 2 other instructors with signatures on documents they hadn't witnessed, an admin contact running background searches through channels that violated every privacy regulation on the books. The case was almost complete. Almost was the problem. Because tomorrow morning, in a location with no cameras and 2 hand-selected witnesses, Colt was going to try to end something. Maybe her assessment. Maybe her cover. Maybe something else, if he'd figured out enough of what she was. And the mission parameter said, "Do not engage." Maya closed her eyes. The mission parameter was written by people who weren't going to be standing on the south course at 0600. She had 12 hours to figure out the difference between following orders and abandoning everything those orders were meant to protect. It was, she thought, going to be a very long night. Maya was already awake when the 0500 alarm didn't sound. She'd been awake since 0340, running the same calculations she'd been running since midnight. Mission parameter versus what was actually about to happen on that south course in 90 minutes. The math kept coming out the same way. The mission said, document the pattern. But the pattern had a person in the middle of it who had no idea what was coming. And that person's name was Daniela Cho. And Maya had told her last night to stay. She got up, dressed in the dark, olive shirt, camo pants, boots laced tight. She checked the recording device under her collar one final time. Green light. She walked out. The south course was isolated by design, a secondary assessment area used for specific evaluations that the main training bay wasn't configured for. The camera station C outage wasn't an accident and wasn't maintenance. Maya had confirmed that 2 days ago through a detail so small that most people would have missed it. The maintenance log on Station C showed a work order submitted the same afternoon Haley had first been asked to pull her file. 40 minutes after Colt had pocketed that intake sheet and told Haley to schedule the solo assessment. He'd planned it before he even knew what he was planning it for. That told her everything she needed to know about how he operated. He didn't make decisions. He built infrastructure. He put pieces in place days ahead of the moment he needed them, which meant he'd done this before, which meant every falsified notation and offline camera and hand-selected witness was part of a system that had been running smoothly for years. Until now. Maya arrived at the south course at 05:53, 7 minutes early. Instructor Marsh was already there. 40 years old, 16 years of service. 2 commendations that Colt had written personally. He was standing with his clipboard and his coffee, and the particular expression of a man who knows he's doing something that can't fully bear examination and has decided not to examine it. He looked at Maya when she arrived, said nothing, wrote her name on the top of the evaluation sheet. Maya stood at the start position and waited. At 05:58, Haley arrived. He walked in, saw Maya, saw Marsh, saw the clipboard, and then looked at the corner where camera station C normally had a mounted unit. The bracket was there. The camera was not. He stopped walking. Marsh glanced at him. "You good?" "Yeah," Haley said. But he didn't move to his position. He stood just inside the course boundary, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw tight, and the look of a man who had made a decision the night before and was now standing inside the moment that decision required something from him. At 0600 exactly, Derek Colt walked onto the south course. He was different outside the training bay, not bigger, but somehow more concentrated, the way a man becomes when he's removed from the audience he performs for and is operating on pure intent. He wore the same uniform, carried the same clipboard, moved with the same deliberate authority. But the performance layer was gone. What was underneath it was harder. He looked at Maya, then at Haley, then back at Maya. "Let's get started," he said. The first 20 minutes were standard. Physical assessment components, timed, with Marsh noting scores on the evaluation sheet. Maya ran them cleanly, not dramatically, just correctly. Every metric in the acceptable range for her classification level, none of them above the line that would make someone ask questions about why a first assessment candidate was performing at a higher tier. She was being careful. Colt was watching her be careful, and that was making him angry. Because careful meant she knew what the acceptable range looked like. And knowing what the acceptable range looked like meant she'd studied this evaluation format. And studying this evaluation format required access that a first cycle candidate in a routine training rotation was not supposed to have. He stopped the assessment at the 22-minute mark. "Reyes," he said, "stop." She stopped, turned, hands loose. "Let's talk about your transfer documentation," Colt said. "Your intake file lists Naval Station Norfolk as your last assignment. I called Norfolk yesterday." Maya's expression didn't change. "They have a Petty Officer First Class Reyes in their personnel system," Colt continued. "But the last recorded duty date is 14 months ago. Before that, the file has a federal classification block that Norfolk's admin office couldn't open." He paused. "So here's my question. Where were you for 14 months? The course was quiet. Haley had gone very still. Marsh was looking at his clipboard, as if it had become suddenly important. Maya looked at Colt with the same clear, direct steadiness she'd had since the first moment he'd called her out of formation. "I'm not at liberty to specify, Senior Chief." "Not at liberty," Colt repeated. The words came out slow and deliberate, the tone of a man who has decided he doesn't need to pretend anymore. "You're standing on my assessment course, Reyes. You're in my rotation, and you are going to tell me who sent you here and why." "I'm a candidate in advanced assessment, Senior Chief. That's all." Colt took 2 steps toward her, not fast, measured. The steps of a man who is used to proximity being a tool. "No, you're not. We both know that. So let's stop performing and have an honest conversation about what's actually happening here." "I'm happy to have that conversation," Maya said, "with Captain Whitfield present." The name landed like something physical. Colt's jaw tightened visibly. "Captain Whitfield has nothing to do with a training assessment." "If this is a training assessment," Maya said, "then Camera Station C should be operational, and there should be a standard witness rotation present. There should be 3 instructors on a solo evaluation, per Regulations Section 4.7, not 2. And the evaluation form Instructor Marsh is using," she didn't look at Marsh, kept her eyes on Colt, "should have a pre-assessment timestamp from the Training Command scheduler, not a handwritten entry." Silence. Marsh looked up from his clipboard. Haley exhaled through his nose, short, sharp. Colt stared at her, and something moved across his face. Not fear, not yet, but the first cellular awareness of a man who has walked into a room he built himself and is suddenly not certain he's the one controlling it. "Who are you?" he said quietly. "I'm Petty Officer First Class Maya Reyes," she said, "and I'd like to continue this assessment with Captain Whitfield present." "That's not your call to make." "No," she agreed. "It's yours. And how you make it in the next 60 seconds is going to matter a great deal." Colt moved fast, not toward her, but toward Marsh. "Give me the evaluation sheet." Marsh hesitated. That hesitation was everything. In 6 years of working under Derek Colt, Instructor Marsh had never once hesitated to give him what he asked for. His hesitation now lasted only 2 seconds. But they were 2 seconds that Haley saw, and Maya saw, and Colt felt. And in the particular economy of authority, 2 seconds of hesitation from a loyal subordinate is a seismic event. Marsh handed him the sheet. Colt took it, looked at it, picked up the pen. And Haley said, "Senior Chief, I can't witness that." Everything stopped. Colt turned and looked at Haley with an expression that was past anger. The cold, specific expression of a man identifying a betrayal. "Excuse me?" Haley's face was pale, but his voice had steadied somewhere between the first word and the second. "I can't put my name on an evaluation form that doesn't have a valid timestamp, offline camera coverage, and only 2 instructors on a solo assessment. That's a reg violation, Senior Chief, and a breath. I can't sign it." The silence on the south course was absolute. Colt stared at Haley for a long moment. Long enough that a younger man might have broken. Haley didn't break. He stood there with his hands out of his pockets now, shoulders back, looking at the man he'd followed without question for 2 years, and making it clear that the following had stopped. Colt's voice came out dangerously quiet. "You want to think very carefully about what you're doing." "I have, Senior Chief," Haley said. "I've been thinking about it since yesterday." The moment held. And then, from the access path behind them, a voice said, "Senior Chief Colt!" Everyone turned. Captain James Whitfield stood at the boundary of the south course. 54 years old, gray at the temples, in his standard uniform, without ceremony, without staff, without announcement. He had walked in during the silence, and nobody had heard him, which meant he'd been there for at least the last 30 seconds, and had heard Haley's refusal. His face was composed in the way that experienced commanders compose their faces when they are witnessing something that confirms a suspicion they have held for a long time, and are deciding exactly how to respond to it. "Captain," Colt said. His voice had changed completely. The dangerous quiet replaced instantly with the register of a man activating his institutional armor. "This is a scheduled individual assessment for—" "I know what it is," Whitfield said. He walked onto the course, stopped beside the evaluation table, looked at the form in Colt's hand, looked at the empty camera bracket, looked at Marsh, who was studying the ground, looked at Haley, who met his eyes directly. Then he looked at Maya. His gaze was brief and entirely unreadable, but it lasted exactly long enough to communicate something. Not recognition, not surprise, just the look of a man orienting to what he's dealing with and deciding his next 3 moves simultaneously. "Petty Officer Reyes," Whitfield said, "do you have anything you need to present to me?" The question was simple, precise. The question of a man who already knows approximately what the answer is and is creating the formal opportunity for it to exist on the record. Maya reached under her collar. 2 fingers. The motion she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times in the last 12 hours, but had never fully committed to until this moment. The moment where the mission parameter and the reality in front of her had finally converged into a single decision, with no more calculation required. She removed the recording device, set it on the evaluation table. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I have everything." The sound Colt made was not a word. It was shorter than a word, a single syllable of air that came from the place where a man's certainty used to be before it collapsed. He stared at the device on the table. Small, black, nondescript. The kind of thing that could sit under a collar for 3 days and nobody would notice unless they were looking for it. He had not been looking for it. "That is an unauthorized surveillance device on a military installation," he said. The voice was controlled. Barely. "That is illegal. That is inadmissible. That is grounds for—" The authorization for that device was signed 41 days ago, Whitfield said. His voice hadn't changed register at all. Still that same composed, level tone that had no heat in it, because it didn't need heat. At the Naval Special Warfare Command level, with full documentation filed through the IG office. He paused. Every recording on that device is completely admissible, Senior Chief. Colt's mouth opened, closed. Whitfield looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to Marsh. Instructor Marsh, you're dismissed. Report to my office at 0800. Marsh left without a word. Fast. Whitfield looked at Haley. His expression shifted by a fraction. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a commander acknowledging what he's just witnessed from someone junior. Thank you, Petty Officer Haley. Wait at the north entrance. Haley nodded once, met Maya's eyes briefly as he turned. She gave him nothing visible, but something in her posture acknowledged what he'd done, and he felt it. And he walked away with the specific dignity of a man who had just done the hardest thing he'd done in his career, and was still standing. That left 3 people on the south course: Whitfield, Colt, Maya. Whitfield picked up the recording device from the table, held it for a moment, set it back down. Derek, he said. First name. The deliberate removal of rank as a signal. I have been receiving complaints about this training rotation for 11 months. Formal complaints, informal complaints, exit interview notations, performance review inconsistencies. 11 months. He paused. Every time I pulled a thread, it disappeared. Files adjusted. Witnesses transferred. Documentation that should have existed, didn't. He looked at Colt steadily. I couldn't prove the pattern. Until now. Colt's face had gone through several things in the last 2 minutes, and had settled into something that was not quite denial and not quite admission. The suspended expression of a man whose options are closing one by one, and who hasn't yet identified the one that survives. Whatever she's recorded contains your voice describing your strategy for removing female candidates from this pipeline, regardless of their performance scores, Whitfield said flatly. In specific detail, for approximately 2 uninterrupted minutes. 3 days ago. He held Colt's gaze. I've already heard it. The silence that followed was the longest silence Maya had stood inside since she arrived at this base. Colt looked at the device, then at Whitfield, then, once, briefly, at Maya. And in that glance was something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation. Something older and heavier than either. The look of a man who has just understood that the infrastructure he spent years building was always going to end here, and some part of him has always known it. He straightened, clasped his hands behind his back. I want legal representation before any further conversation, he said. That's your right, Whitfield said. You're suspended pending formal investigation effective this moment. You will surrender your access credentials to the duty officer at 0700. You will not contact any member of this training rotation or any base personnel connected to these proceedings. He paused. Do you understand? Yes, Colt said. One word. Flat and final. The word of a man who has run out of the other kinds. He turned and walked off the south course without looking back. Whitfield watched him go. Then he stood quietly for a moment with his hands at his sides, and Maya watched him absorb what had just happened, with the practiced stillness of someone who has seen institutions fail people before and carries the weight of that as a permanent resident of his chest. He looked at her. How long? He asked. 3 days on base, sir. 41 days total from authorization. And you were going to stay within parameters the entire time. It wasn't quite a question. Maya answered it anyway, Until this morning, sir. The solo assessment configuration changed the calculation. Whitfield nodded slowly. The 3 female candidates from the previous cycle. You have documentation on all of them? Every falsified notation. The admin contact running unauthorized background checks. Instructor signatures on assessments they didn't conduct. She paused. And the solo assessment scheduling pattern. This was the 4th time a candidate flagged for removal was directed to this course with Station C offline. Whitfield closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Opened them. You'll brief me fully at 0800, he said. Complete debrief. Everything on that device and everything in your documentation. Yes, sir. He picked up the evaluation form from the table, the one Colt had been holding when Haley refused to sign it. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it once and put it in his uniform pocket. Petty Officer Reyes, he said. Sir? You were told not to engage. Yes, sir. A pause. Whitfield looked at her with an expression that held several things at once. The assessment of a commander, the recognition of a man who understands why a line gets crossed, and something underneath both that might have been the closest thing he allowed himself to relief. Petty Officer Haley refused to sign the form before you presented the device, he said. Yes, sir, he did. You saw that? Yes, sir. Whitfield nodded once, looked out at the empty course for a moment. I'll note in the record, he said quietly, that the investigation parameters were maintained until a specific change in circumstances required a judgment call, and that the judgment call was correct. He turned and walked off the course. Maya stood alone on the south course for 30 seconds. The recording device was still on the evaluation table. She picked it up carefully, put it back under her collar. Green light, still running. She thought about Daniela Cho waking up right now in the barracks, going through her morning routine, preparing for another day of doing everything right and expecting it to count for nothing. By 0800, that was going to change. Maya walked toward the north entrance. The sun was fully up now, and the base was loud with the sounds of a normal morning that had no idea what had just happened on its south course. That was about to change too. The 0800 debrief lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Whitfield sat across from Maya with a legal pad, a secure recorder, and the expression of a man who had been waiting 11 months for this conversation and was going to conduct it with absolute precision, regardless of what it cost him emotionally to hear. He asked his questions in order. She answered them in order. When he needed clarification, he asked once, clearly, and she gave it without decoration. The recording device sat on the table between them. Whitfield didn't touch it again. He didn't need to. He'd listened to the relevant sections before she arrived, and the 2 minutes of Colt's unguarded voice describing his pipeline removal strategy had settled into him the way certain things settle. Not with shock, because some part of him had known, but with the particular heaviness of confirmation, of finally having the shape of a thing he'd only been able to feel the edges of before. When Maya finished, Whitfield set down his pen. The admin contact, he said. Base personnel management. Marcus Webb. You have documentation on the unauthorized background searches? Timestamps, access logs, and a recorded conversation in which Colt explicitly requests a search outside official channels. She paused. Webb knew what he was doing. The conversation makes that clear. Whitfield nodded. Instructor Marsh. Signed 7 falsified notations over 4 months. 2 of them attached to candidates who washed out. She met his eyes. He knew the scores were wrong when he signed them. He said so in the recording. Not directly, but the implication is unambiguous. He said, and I quote, "If the numbers don't match, we adjust the narrative." The room was quiet for a moment. Adjust the narrative, Whitfield repeated. The words came out flat and precise, the way a man repeats something when he wants to make sure he has heard it correctly and will not forget it. Yes, sir. He looked at the legal pad, at the column of names and dates and notations he'd been building for 2 hours. 6 months of falsified documentation. 3 female candidates washed out. A fourth, Daniela Cho, currently in the pipeline and accumulating marginal notations that contradicted every objective metric. Cho's actual scores, he said. Unmanipulated. Top 20% of the current cohort in physical metrics. Top 15 in cognitive assessment. Her tactical response time on the 3rd station was the 2nd best in the group. Maya paused. She's been told in 3 separate notation reviews that she lacks command presence. Whitfield's jaw tightened by a degree. By Colt. And countersigned by Marsh. He set down the pen, stood, walked to the window, not looking out, just needing to move, needing the 3 steps it took to get there as a way of managing what was building in his chest. He stood with his back to the room for a long moment. Then he said, without turning, "The 3 previous washouts. Names." Maya gave them, all 3. He wrote them down. He turned back. "I'm going to personally contact each of them. Their washout assessments will be formally reviewed and overturned where the falsification is documented." He looked at her steadily. "That process will take time. The documentation will have to be airtight." "It is, sir." He believed her. At 0940, Whitfield convened the command staff meeting. Not a full formation. Not yet. Just the 6 senior officers of the training rotation. Department heads, the senior training coordinator, the IG liaison who was permanently assigned to Coronado. He walked them through the investigation summary in 40 minutes. No editorializing. No emotional language. Just the record, the documentation, and the findings. When he finished, the room held the specific quality of silence that follows information that is both surprising and not surprising. The silence of people who, on some level, had registered something wrong in the way a room registers a temperature change before anyone consciously names it. Commander Rachel Torres, the senior training coordinator, was 51 years old and had run assessment cycles at Coronado for 9 years. She looked at the falsified notation samples Whitfield had printed and said, "I flagged 2 of these. Colt's verbal assessments contradicted the written notations on both of them. I was told the discrepancy was a documentation timing issue." "Who told you that?" Whitfield asked. "Colt." "In writing?" "No." A pause. "Verbally. In a hallway." The IG liaison, Lieutenant Commander Dan Price, 43, the kind of man whose entire career had been spent in the space between what institutions said they were and what they actually did, opened his folder and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Captain, I need to formalize a complaint under my office's independent channel. Today, before Colt's legal team moves." "Do it," Whitfield said. "I want it filed before 1200. "Done." Price was already writing. Torres looked at Whitfield. "The current cycle candidates, Cho specifically. What happens to her assessment standing while this processes?" "Her current notation record is frozen, effective this morning," Whitfield said. "No evaluation inputs from Colt, Marsh, or any instructor who countersigned his documentation. Her objective scores stand as recorded by independent stations." He paused. "She continues. Full standing." Torres nodded. Then, after a moment, "The other candidates in the current cycle who were present for the combatives demonstration yesterday." The throat grip. She said it plainly, the way a senior officer names something that needs to be named. "That was witnessed by 40 people." "I know." "That's going to come out in the proceedings." "I know that too," Whitfield said. It's documented on the recording. Torres looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. Captain, when you address the full formation, and you're going to have to address the full formation, what are you going to say? It was the question that had been sitting in the back of the room since the meeting started. Everyone in that space knew the investigation was proceeding. Everyone knew Colt was suspended. What nobody knew yet was how the institution was going to speak about itself, whether it was going to frame this as one bad actor, or whether it was going to do the harder, more necessary thing, and name the conditions that had allowed one bad actor to operate uninterrupted for years. Whitfield looked at her. The truth, he said simply. Maya spent the hours between the debrief and noon in the one place nobody looked for a person processing something significant, the equipment maintenance room, performing gear checks on the second shift's training kit with a methodical focus of someone who finds moving their hands useful when their mind is working hard. She was halfway through the third equipment rack when Haley found her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She kept working. You didn't have to include what I did in the debrief, he said. The refusal. Whitfield already knew about it from the recording. But you didn't have to frame it the way you did. I framed it accurately, she said. You framed it generously. He paused. I signed 6 months of paperwork I shouldn't have signed. That's in the record, too. Yes, she said. It is. She set down the piece of equipment she was checking, looked at him. You made a different decision yesterday. I documented both things because both things are true. What happens with that is above both our pay grades. Haley was quiet for a moment. Will it be enough? What I did yesterday? Will it offset? I don't know, Maya said honestly. I'm not in the business of predicting what institutions do with the people who finally stop doing the wrong thing. She paused. But I'll tell you what I know. The moment you said you couldn't sign that form was the moment everything else became possible. Without that, Whitfield walks onto the course and finds a solo assessment that looks borderline at worst. With it, he walks onto a course where Colt is holding an unsigned fraudulent evaluation and 2 instructors have just split. She met his eyes. You changed the temperature of that room. That mattered. Haley absorbed that. It didn't dissolve the weight he was carrying. She could see that clearly. But it organized it somehow. Gave it a shape he could work with. What happens to the women who washed out? He asked. Whitfield is reaching out, overturning the assessments where the falsification is documented. She paused. 2 of them might come back. The third is already moved on. But their records will be corrected. The official story about why they left will change. That's... He stopped, started again. That should have happened a long time ago. Yes, Maya said. It should have. She went back to the equipment check. After a moment, Haley picked up the next item on the rack and started checking it beside her. Not because she needed help, but because it was something to do with his hands while he figured out how to carry the next part of his career. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. It was, Maya thought, one of the more honest conversations she'd had on this base. At 1400 hours, Whitfield called the full formation. Every personnel member on the base attached to the training command, officers, senior enlisted, junior candidates, civilian contractors with base access. 411 people assembled in the main briefing structure. Word had been moving since morning, the way word always moves on military bases, in the specific currency of half information and confirmed fragments. And the room had the charged, waiting quality of people who know something significant has happened and are preparing themselves for the official version of it. Daniela Cho stood in the second row, third from the left. She had heard, through the morning's layered whispers, that Colt was suspended, that there was an investigation, that the training rotation had been restructured under Commander Torres pending review. She didn't know the details, She didn't know about Maya. She didn't know that her assessment record was currently frozen, with her objective scores intact. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, and her jaw set, the way it had been set for 3 weeks. The jaw of someone bracing for impact as a default posture, because impact had been the default for so long that the bracing had become automatic. Whitfield stood at the front of the room. He didn't use notes. 3 weeks ago, he said, a formal investigation was authorized into the training assessment practices of this command. That investigation concluded this morning. I'm not going to walk you through the findings in detail. That's the appropriate work of the formal proceedings, and it will be done through proper channels with full documentation. He paused. What I am going to tell you is this. The room was absolute. 400 people and the sound of the ventilation system and nothing else. Performance standards in this command exist for one purpose, Whitfield said, to measure capability, not to be applied selectively based on who the evaluating instructor believes belongs here and who he has decided doesn't, not to be used as instruments of removal against candidates who have demonstrated the capability this program demands, but who present as the wrong gender, the wrong background, or the wrong anything else. He stopped. Let that land. That is not a training failure. That is not an administrative failure. That is a character failure. And it occurred in this command, under my command, for a period of time that I intend to account for publicly and completely. Nobody moved. 3 candidates who completed this pipeline's evaluation cycle over the previous 6 months did not fail, Whitfield continued. They were failed. Their records are under formal review and will be corrected. Each of them will be personally contacted by my office this week. A pause. That is the minimum the institution owes them. I am aware that it is not sufficient. I am also aware that being aware of insufficiency and naming it out loud is not the same as fixing it. The fixing takes longer. It starts today. In the second row, Daniela Cho's hands, clasped behind her back. Regulation posture. The posture she'd been maintaining since week 1, unlocked slowly. One hand found the other in front of her body. She held her own hands quietly, without making a sound, and looked at the front of the room. Whitfield looked across the formation. We do not get to claim the reputation of this institution without accepting responsibility for what it does in the dark, he said. Every person in this room who has witnessed something in this training environment that didn't match the standards we publicly claim and said nothing. I'm speaking to you. Not with punishment, with a request. The request is this. Don't do it again. The culture of this command is not set by the people who make the policies. It is set by what each of you decides to tolerate in the spaces between the policies. He paused for the last time. That starts right now. We're done. He stepped back from the front. The room didn't applaud, didn't break into noise. It released. The slow, careful release of 400 people who had just been told something true about themselves and were deciding individually what to do with it. Daniela Cho stood in the second row and did not move for a long moment. Then she looked to her left, then to her right, at the people standing beside her in the formation, candidates she'd been competing against for 3 weeks, who had watched the same evaluation she'd watched, and had the same information she had about what the scores actually were versus what they were posted as. The woman to her left, a candidate named Sorrells, 26, 3rd week, met her eyes and said very quietly, "Your tactical response time on Station 3 was the second best in the group."
I clocked it myself.
Daniela looked at her. "I know," she said. "So does everybody else," Sorrells said. Maya watched the formation from the back of the room. Olive shirt, dark hair loose. Standing exactly where she'd been standing since she arrived at this base. In the space where nobody was paying particular attention. Logging what was happening with steady eyes and a mind that converted everything it saw into usable information. She watched Whitfield step back from the front. She watched the room release. She watched Daniela Cho unlock her hands. And she thought about the calculation she'd been running since midnight. The one between the mission parameter and the thing the mission parameter was written to protect. The distance between following orders and doing what the orders were for. The room began to disperse. Personnel moving toward exits, toward the afternoon rotation, toward whatever the rest of the day required. A hand touched her left arm. Brief, 2 fingers. She turned. Chief Instructor Brenda Salas. The woman who had run her name that first morning, who had seen the classification flag and made a phone call that had started the second clock running. They had not spoken directly since then, not once in 3 days, not a word, not an acknowledged look. Salas looked at her now, with the expression of someone who has assembled a picture over several days from pieces that were never presented to her whole. "You are going to stay in parameters the entire time," Salas said quietly. "Yes," Maya said. "Until he set up the solo assessment." "Yes." Salas studied her for a moment. "When you walked onto that course this morning, you knew Whitfield was coming." Maya met her eyes. "I requested his presence last night through a back channel. I didn't know if he'd arrive in time." A pause. "I went in ready for either version." Salas absorbed that. "The call I made, when I flagged your cover. It generated a notification to my oversight contact," Maya said. "Not to Colt's network. You called someone outside his structure." A small exhale from Salas. The breath of a woman who has just learned that a decision she made on instinct 3 days ago had consequences she didn't fully know until this moment. "I didn't know who you were," Salas said. "I just knew something was wrong." "That was enough," Maya said. Salas looked at her one more time. Then she nodded, a single, small motion that carried more weight than any ceremony, and walked away. Maya stood alone at the back of the emptying room. The formal proceedings against Colt and Webb and Marsh would run for weeks. The overturned assessments would take longer. The 3 women who had been washed out falsely would have to decide for themselves what to do with the correction of their records. And that decision belonged entirely to them. And some of them would come back. And some of them would have already built something else. And the institution would owe all of them the same thing, regardless of what they chose. None of that was finished. But Daniela Cho was still in this pipeline. With her objective scores intact and her assessment record frozen, and the truth of her performance finally, formally, on record. That had started last night in a dark barracks with 2 words. Don't quit. And Daniela hadn't. Maya walked toward the exit. She had a full debrief to file, a chain of custody report on the recording device, and the classified after-action summary that would be read by people at the Naval Special Warfare Command level, who would use it to determine whether the investigation protocol she'd just completed was replicable in other training commands where the same patterns might be running in the dark. It was, she understood, the kind of work that never ended. There was no single case that fixed the thing the case was about. There were only more cases, more documentation, more people in more dark barracks needing someone to say, "Your numbers are right. Stay in. Don't let 'em make you forget what you know." She pushed through the door into the afternoon. The base was loud and ordinary around her, and somewhere behind her, in the main briefing structure, Captain James Whitfield was standing alone at the front of an empty room, looking at the space where 400 people had just been, and carrying the specific weight of a man who has finally said out loud what he should have said 11 months ago. Some weights don't get lighter when you name them, but they get possible to carry. The formal investigation took 6 weeks, not because the evidence was thin. It was the opposite of thin. The recording device alone contained enough to end Colt's career 3 times over. What took 6 weeks was the architecture of accountability. Every falsified document cross-referenced against the original objective scores. Every unauthorized background search traced through the access logs. Every signature on every fraudulent evaluation matched to the instructor who had pressed pen to paper and decided that their career alignment with Derek Colt was worth more than the truth. Maya was not present for most of it. That was by design. Her role had ended the moment the recording device left her collar and landed on that evaluation table. The institution took it from there. Whitfield's team, the IG office, the Naval Special Warfare Command Oversight Division that had authorized her deployment 41 days earlier and was now processing her after-action report with the focused attention of people who had suspected this pattern existed in other training commands and now had a documented template for finding it. She had filed her chain of custody report, her classified debrief, her full written account of every observation from every day of her deployment, cross-indexed with timestamps from the recording. Then she had returned to her bunk, packed her issued gear, and waited for orders. The orders came on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after the South Course. She was to report back to her unit within 72 hours. Standard reintegration protocol. No ceremony, no formal acknowledgement of what she had done. Not publicly, not on any record that would ever be available outside the specific classified file maintained by the office that had sent her here. She was sitting on the edge of her bunk, reading the orders on her secure phone, when the barracks door opened and Daniela Cho walked in. Daniela stopped when she saw Maya's gear packed, took in the bag, the cleared bunk space, the phone in Maya's hand. Her face moved through several things quickly. Recognition, calculation, and then something more complicated that took longer to settle. "You're leaving," she said. "In the morning," Maya said. Daniela walked to the bunk across from her and sat down. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at her hands for a moment, then at Maya. "I want to ask you something directly," she said. "And I want you to answer me the same way." "Okay. Were you ever actually a candidate in this cycle?" The question sat between them in the specific air of a moment that has been coming for 9 days and has finally arrived. Maya looked at her steadily. "No." Daniela absorbed that. 1 breath, 2. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" "Long enough." "How old are you?" 22. Something crossed Daniela's face. Not surprise exactly, more the particular recalibration of a person updating their understanding of what 22 years old can contain. She had been thinking of Maya, unconsciously, as someone older. The stillness, the precision, the way she absorbed pressure without redistribution, those weren't qualities Daniela associated with 22. They were qualities she associated with someone who had already paid for them. "The women who washed out," Daniela said. "Whitfield's office called all 3 of them this week. I heard from Sorrells, who heard from admin." She paused. 2 of them are considering coming back." "Good," Maya said. "One of them has been out for 4 months. She got a job, built something. She's not sure she wants to restart." A pause. "Is that a failure? After everything that was done to get her record corrected?" "No," Maya said. "Her record being corrected is what she's owed. What she does after that belongs to her. Those are 2 separate things." Daniela looked at her. "You really believe that?" "I do." Because you're not invested in the outcome. You just want the record to be true. Maya considered that for a moment. I want the next woman who shows up with everything it takes to actually get to prove it. What anyone does with a fair shot after that is their own business. She paused. But yeah, mostly, I want the record to be true. Daniela was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I passed Station 7 this morning, the one I've been flagging on for 3 weeks. Cleared it by 40 seconds. I know, Maya said. I checked the posted scores before I came back here. Daniela looked at her. You checked my scores? I check everything. A pause. And then, for the first time since Maya had known her, through 3 weeks of targeted pressure and barracks darkness and hands clasped behind a back as armor, Daniela Cho laughed. Short and real, the laugh of someone surprised into it, and it changed her face into something that had more room in it than the face she'd been wearing since week 1. You're unbelievable, she said. I've been told, Maya said. They sat in the quiet for a moment. The barracks had that late evening quality, the particular stillness of a building full of people who are tired in the specific way that comes from doing hard things and knowing tomorrow requires more of the same. Thank you, Daniela said. The words were simple and direct and carried no performance in them. For the night you told me to stay. I was 3 hours from submitting my withdrawal. I know, Maya said. How? Because that's how long the paperwork takes, and you'd been in the admin office earlier that afternoon asking about the withdrawal process. Maya looked at her evenly. I told you, I check everything. Daniela shook her head slowly. Is there anything you didn't know? Maya thought about it honestly for a moment. Whether you were actually going to listen. That one, I didn't know. Daniela held her gaze. I almost didn't. But you did. But I did. They sat with that for a moment. The full, quiet weight of a decision made in the dark by one person who had no guarantee it would matter, and another person who had no guarantee it was safe to trust it, and both of them choosing anyway. That was the whole story distilled. Everything else was documentation. The next twist came at 06:30 the following morning. Maya was in the processing office, completing her departure paperwork, when Whitfield walked in. Not with staff, not with ceremony, just him, in his working uniform, holding a sealed envelope. He set it on the desk in front of her. She looked at it. Her name was on the front, in his handwriting. Nothing else. You're not required to open that here, he said. Or at all. But I wanted to give it to you before you left. She picked it up, opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not official letterhead, personal stationery. 4 sentences in the same handwriting as the envelope. She read it, kept her expression steady, folded it once, and put it in her inside pocket. You didn't have to do this, sir, she said. I know, Whitfield said. That's why I did it. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she had come to recognize in him over the past 9 days. The look of a man who is recalibrating something fundamental about how he has been running his command and is doing it without flinching from what the recalibration costs him. The investigation findings were submitted to NSWC oversight yesterday, he said, along with a formal recommendation to audit the same assessment patterns at 2 other training commands where Colt had prior rotations. He paused. Your after-action report was cited as the operational template. Maya nodded once. There's something else, Whitfield said. Haley submitted a voluntary sworn statement this week. Full account of every document he signed over the past 6 months. His own initiative, before anyone asked him. He paused. His JAG brother apparently drove down from D.C. to help him write it. Maya didn't say anything, but something in her posture shifted. A fraction of settling. The way a structure settles when a load it has been managing is distributed correctly. What happens to him? She asked. Formal review board. But his voluntary disclosure and his refusal on the course are both in the record. The board will weigh everything. Whitfield held her gaze. He'll probably survive it. He'll be different after, but he'll survive. Good, Maya said. Whitfield looked at her one more time. The look of a commanding officer who has something further to say and is deciding whether saying it is his place. He decided it was. You were 22 years old, he said quietly. Deployed alone. Ordered not to engage. And on the morning everything depended on a judgment call that your orders didn't cover. You made the right one. He paused. I want you to know that I know that. Even if the record that matters to your career can't say it directly. Maya held his gaze for a moment. The record that mattered, sir, she said, was Daniela Cho's. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. With the full weight of a man who understands he has just been given a lesson by someone less than half his age and has the integrity to receive it. He turned and walked out. The final thing happened an hour before Maya's departure transport arrived. She was outside, gear at her feet, going through the habitual last check of everything she was carrying, when she heard footsteps and looked up to find not one person, but 4 walking toward her across the open area. Daniela, Sorrells, 2 other candidates from the current cycle whose names Maya had logged on day 1 and had watched perform cleanly through 3 weeks of a rotation designed to demoralize them. They stopped in front of her. Nobody spoke immediately. The 4 of them stood there, in the way people stand when they have agreed to do something together and are now in the moment of doing it, and the moment is heavier than the agreement felt in advance. Then Daniela said, We wanted to say goodbye, the 4 of us. She paused. And we wanted to say it in a way that meant something. Not just, thank you, goodbye. She looked at Maya directly. We know what you were here to do, not the specifics, but enough. Maya looked at the 4 of them, 22, 24, 25, 26 years old. 4 women who had shown up to one of the hardest training pipelines in the American military, with everything it required, and had encountered a system actively working to tell them they were wrong about themselves. 3 weeks of that, some of them longer, and all 4 of them still standing. You don't need to say anything, Maya said. We know, Daniela said. We want to. Sorrells stepped forward slightly. I've been in this pipeline for 6 weeks. Before this week, I had started adjusting my internal scores the way you described, running my own numbers and discounting them before I even saw the posted version. She paused. I didn't notice I was doing it until Daniela told me what you said. A breath. I stopped. Yesterday morning, I stopped. The woman beside her, Candidate Park, 25, who had said almost nothing to anyone in 3 weeks, and had the contained, precise quality of someone who expressed everything through performance, said, Same. 1 word, but the word of someone who doesn't spend them lightly. The 4th candidate, Torres, 26, whose sister had washed out of a different training command 2 years earlier, under circumstances that had never been formally explained, looked at Maya with eyes that held more than the present moment. My sister's at Pendleton now. She's good. She built something. But she should have been given what she was owed 3 years ago. She stopped. What you did here matters to people who will never know your name. Maya stood with that for a moment. 4 faces. 4 women who had no idea she was 22 years old, that she'd spent 9 days sleeping in the same barracks they slept in, and eating the same food, and running the same evolutions, while simultaneously documenting every falsified score in a mental ledger she could recall with perfect accuracy, on demand. 4 women who thought they were thanking someone who had done something for them. What she knew, and couldn't tell them, was that she had walked into this base with a mission and a parameter and a recording device, and 0 guarantee that any of it would land the way it needed to. That the night she had spoken to Daniela in the dark had been a choice that violated her operational instructions, and that she would make again without hesitation. That the morning on the South Course had required her to stand in front of a man who had put his hand around her throat and answer his questions with steady eyes, while calculating the exact moment to reach under her collar. None of that was exceptional to her. It was the job. The job she had chosen and been built for, and would return to tomorrow, in a different building, under different orders, with a different name on her intake sheet. What was exceptional, what would stay with her longer than any of the operational details, was Daniela's one word in the dark. Okay. The smallest possible unit of trust, offered with no evidence that it was warranted. Maya looked at the four of them. "Keep your own scores," she said. "Every evolution, every station, every timed assessment. Know your real number before anyone posts it. Don't let anyone else's version of your performance replace your own. Not here, not after here, not anywhere you go in this institution." She paused. "The people who benefit most from you doubting your own numbers are the ones who can't compete with the real ones." She picked up her gear bag. "You all belong here," she said. "You know that now. Don't unknow it." She walked toward the transport without looking back. Behind her, she heard nothing. No words, no movement. Just the particular silence of four people standing with something they intended to keep. 6 weeks after Maya's departure, the formal investigation concluded. Derek Colt was separated from service. Not retired, separated, with full loss of benefits related to the falsified assessment period. The language of the finding was precise and unsparing. Willful falsification of performance records. Systematic targeting of candidates based on gender. Conduct unbecoming. His 31 citations did not appear in the summary. They were not relevant to what he had done. Marcus Webb, the admin contact, received a formal reprimand and demotion. The unauthorized background search documentation was referred to the base legal office for further action. Instructor Marsh accepted a reduced administrative role pending an ethics review board. His voluntary cooperation with the investigation, offered after 3 days of consulting a lawyer and then dismissing the lawyer, was noted in the record. Haley's review board met on a Wednesday in November. His voluntary sworn statement, his refusal on the South Course, and the testimony of Captain Whitfield, who appeared at the board in person without being required to, and said that Haley's refusal had been an act of institutional integrity under significant personal pressure, resulted in a formal reprimand without rank reduction. He remained in the command. He requested the transfer to a different rotation 6 weeks later, and it was granted. Of the 3 previously washed-out female candidates whose records were corrected, 2 accepted reinstatement into the assessment pipeline. One of them, a woman named Lieutenant Priya Shah, who had been out of the program for 5 months and had spent that time quietly rebuilding herself around a decision she'd been told was her own failure, completed her first full evolution back in the program with the 3rd best time of the cohort. She didn't know who had documented her case. She didn't need to. Daniela Cho completed the advanced assessment cycle 8 weeks after Maya's departure. Her final evaluation was conducted under Commander Torres's direct oversight, with a 3-instructor panel, full camera coverage, and objective scores posted in real time to a display that every candidate in the rotation could see. Her performance score was in the top 12% of the program. Her command presence notation read, "Exceptional." She read it standing in the assessment bay at 0800 on a Thursday morning, with the rest of the cohort around her and Sorrells to her left, and the full weight of everything the previous 8 weeks had required her to carry, now converted, finally, into something she could stand on. She thought about a dark barracks at 2,200 hours, and a woman sitting on the opposite bunk who had told her the problem was not her. She had believed it then because she needed to. She believed it now because she had proved it. Maya received Daniela's final score through a secure channel 3 days after it was posted. Her oversight contact had flagged it as a follow-up item from the Coronado investigation. Standard case closure protocol. She read it once. Then she closed the file, picked up her gear, and reported to the water for the morning evolution. Olive shirt soaked through, dark hair tied loose, camouflage pants heavy with salt, the kind of cold that requires you to be fully present because there is no room in it for anything else. She stood at the edge before the dive and let the morning sit in her for a moment. The base behind her, the water ahead, 22 years old and already carrying the specific weight that comes from doing work that nobody will announce and nobody will celebrate, and that matters more than either of those things would anyway. She thought about the 4 women standing outside the barracks, about Haley in a bathroom on the 2nd floor, making the hardest phone call of his career, about Whitfield reading 4 sentences on personal stationery and deciding that naming what you know matters even when the record can't say it, about a hand around her throat and a room full of witnesses and the decision to stand perfectly still. She dove. Some institutions change because they're forced to. Some change because someone documents the pattern so completely that the pattern can't survive the documentation. And some change, slowly, imperfectly, always incompletely, because one person at a time decides that the distance between what the institution claims to be and what it actually is a distance worth spending yourself to close. Maya Reyes was 22 years old. She had a recording device and a mission parameter, and the patience to let the truth do what the truth does when it's finally given a clean surface to rest on. She had done her job. And somewhere, on a base she would never publicly be connected to, 4 women were standing in training water at dawn, with their own scores memorized and their own ground held. And the next woman who showed up, with everything it took, was going to find a rotation that could no longer afford to lie about what it saw. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything.